Simon says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
Hello, and welcome to this Getting Started in Jira course. My name is Dan Lefebvre, and for over a decade now, I've consulted and developed processes, standards, and workflows for organizations around the world that are using Jira for project management. Today, we're going to uncover the key features you need to know to master Jira's powerful capabilities. We'll start by learning some of the terms and concepts that we'll find inside of Jira. From there, we'll get familiar with Jira's team-managed projects before hopping into the company-managed projects in Jira. And, of course, we'll also learn the differences between team and company-managed projects so you'll know when it's best to use one over the other. Finally, we'll wrap up this course learning how to customize Jira for your team using its administrative backend. Now, we've got a ton to cover throughout this course, so let's hop on the computer and kick things off in our next video by getting familiar with some of the different versions of Jira that are available. As you're following along with this course, you might notice things on my screen look a little bit different than yours. In this video, I'll explain why that might happen. Simply put, it's because Jira has different versions. So this is a look at the most common versions of Jira that you'll come across. And the primary thing to keep in mind is that they will affect what features you have available, but the core features are the same. And that's what we're going to be learning throughout this course. So it doesn't matter what version of Jira you're using, this course will still be relevant to you. Just think of it kind of like how you can get a car. You can get the same model car with different options, maybe a 2-door option, a 4-door option, maybe a hatchback. There's different options available, but the same core engine driving it. So learning how to use that car is the same, regardless of which options there are, at least the core features of it. So let's break down these different versions a little bit more. Jira Software is the flagship version of Jira. So most of the time when you hear anyone talking about Jira, this is the version that they're talking about. It's called Jira Software because it's designed to be an issue tracking and agile project management tool for software developers. And that leads us into Jira Work Management. Now, because a lot of non-developers use Jira for general project management, Atlassian originally split off a light version of Jira Software that they called Jira Core. It just had the core features. Then, back in 2021, they built more functionality, changed the licensing some, and then rebranded Jira Core as Jira Work Management. Now, the next version of Jira is Jira Service Management, which used to be called Service Desk. Basically, it adds help desk functionality, so the ability for customers to create support tickets that your team can then track and handle on the back end in Jira Service Management. Then, the last version here is Jira Product Discovery. As the name implies, it's designed for product teams to ideate, capture those ideas, prioritize them, and then build them out on the roadmap to then get it done. Now, in 2024, Atlassian decided to merge together Jira Software and Jira Work Management again back into one product simply called Jira. Quite honestly, there was a lot of overlap in the functionality. As I mentioned, they were split off to begin with. And this is just my own speculation, but from my experience, I think it caused some confusion between the two versions. So I'm glad that they merged them together. And since Jira is now the flagship product, that's what we'll be using in this course. Now, with all of that said, I want to point out the versions like Jira Software, Jira Work Management, because you still might see them in your organization. And the reason for that has to do with Jira's licensing. For example, as we just learned, Jira Software and Jira Work Management merged together in 2024. But if you're still using an older version of Jira, that means you might actually still have a license to Jira Software or Jira Work Management. So there are two ways to license Jira. And this first one here, Data Center, really could be the reason why your version of Jira looks different than mine. For example, one of my consulting clients recently was still using a version of Jira that's about 6 years old. So, of course, Atlassian has made a lot of updates in 6 years, including some overhauls to the interface. So their version looked different than mine running the latest version of Jira. And that leads me into the cloud license, because that works like any other subscription that we're all used to. Atlassian handles all the updates and maintenance, and as long as you have a subscription, they'll automatically update you to the latest version of Jira as it's released. Now, the catch to a cloud license is that running on Atlassian servers, they're not going to let you do a lot of custom coding on their servers. So it is not as customizable as Jira can be with a data center license. Of course, not everybody needs to do all that customization. And the cloud license is what I'm going to be using in this course, which means as of this recording, it is the latest version of Jira. But if you're using a data center license with an older version, like my client, things might look a little bit different on your end. But as I mentioned earlier, regardless of whether you're using the latest version with a Jira Cloud or data center license, or if your organization has an older version with a data center license, you'll still get value from this course because those core features are the same. For example, Jira's project boards from the beginning, well over a decade ago. Jira has always used an agile workflow, which we'll cover more of what that means if you're not familiar with agile. But overall, the core features have been the same, even if the interface has changed here and there. Now, before we wrap up this video, there are two more quick things to keep in mind when it comes to the different versions of Jira. And the first is that if you are using a subscription, Jira does have different subscription levels that can have an effect on the features that you'll have access to inside of Jira. Now, in my experience, the standard subscription, that plan is the one that's most popularly used, unless your organization really needs some of the increased caps on things like storage and automation, or if you want to use AI. But a standard license is what we're going to be using in this course. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out about this course is one of the extremely powerful things about Jira is that you can use apps from the Atlassian marketplace to extend its capabilities. Most of these apps are an additional cost, though, on top of Jira itself. And there are also thousands of them. So from a practical perspective, there's no way for me to know the specific combination of apps your organization is using, if any at all. So for those reasons, I'm not going to be using any third-party apps. Software doesn't come in boxes anymore like it did back in the early days of my career, but the phrase is still a common one, out of the box. So this course is all about understanding Jira out of the box without any extra add-ons, plugins, or apps. So to recap, in this course, I'll be using Jira on the cloud, which means it's the most recent version of Jira as of this recording. And I'm also using the standard pricing tier because that'll let us dig into all the core features that we need to know to get up to speed inside of Jira. And lastly, I want to point out that throughout this course, I'll be using my personal instance of Jira, and that's simply to keep the privacy of my clients, private. So we'll be using my personal Jira instance throughout this course. Okay. That wraps up this section. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next section where we'll start to unpack some of the key terms and concepts that you need to know before we dive into Jira. In this video, we'll take a couple minutes to understand exactly what Jira is and what it's used for. Simply put, Jira is a project management and issue tracking tool. As a fun little fact, the name Jira comes from Gojira, the Japanese name for Godzilla, because the team at Atlassian used a popular bug tracking tool called Bugzilla before developing what we now know as Jira. Now, that was many, many years ago. But there are a lot of different ways that companies organize their projects. Waterfall, Six Sigma, Prince 2, and so on. Some of those methodologies or ways of organizing and getting work done are similar. Some of them are quite different from each other. Overall, the methodology a company uses can determine what tool they use to organize everything. And when it comes to Jira, it was built around what is probably the most popular project management method for software developers, Agile. When you're using Jira, it just assumes that your team is using the Agile methodology. Now, I have worked with teams who have used apps or plugins to get Jira to organize things in a different way, like Waterfall. But by default, and without any extended capabilities, Jira itself is an Agile tool. Now, this course is not designed to be a deep dive into Agile methodology, but there are a lot of Agile terms and concepts that we'll come across inside of Jira. So that's why it's important to take the time to understand some core concepts. Now, if you're already familiar with Agile, then great. You can skip over some of the terms and concepts in the next few videos. But if you're new to Agile or want a quick refresher, then I'll see you in the next video where we'll get a crash course on the basics of Agile methodology. In our last video, we learned how Jira expects you to understand Agile methodology. So in this video, we'll get an overview of what that means. Now, before we begin, I want to point out, this is not going to be an in-depth look at Agile. The purpose of this course is to focus on Jira, but as we just learned in the last video, Jira just assumes that you already know a lot of Agile concepts. So that's the purpose of this video, to give a crash course on Agile methodology in a single video. So Agile is a software development methodology focused on empowering teams to efficiently organize their work through self-management and collaboration. For our purposes today, there are some key things about Agile that are always helpful to keep in mind when we're working in Jira. First, the concept of Agile methodology was born in the software development world. So as you might expect, that's why Jira has a lot of tools for software developers. But if you're not a software developer, you might still be using Jira. If you recall, when we learned about the different versions of Jira, there were more versions than Jira software. And those other versions still use the same concepts born out of Agile methodology and the software development world. So with that in mind, it's probably no surprise that Jira is built for teams. It's not really a personal task management system, but Jira is designed to work best with teams. So there are a lot of great collaboration features that we'll be learning about throughout this course inside of Jira. Now, it might seem like quite a contrast to team-based project management and have self-management in the definition. But this is one of the key things about Agile that makes it so great for knowledge workers in any team environment, because it's a mixture of the best of both worlds. It's a framework for teams to collaborate while giving each person on the team the freedom to make the best decision for what work they need to get done. So that all sounds nice from a theoretical point of view, but practically, how does a team using Agile methodology make this happen? The backbone of how this all works is through an Agile board. Now, an Agile board is not unique to Jira. In fact, I've worked with teams in the past who prefer to use just a simple whiteboard with sticky notes for them to track their work. But physical whiteboards won't work for everyone, of course, especially if you have remote workers. And there is no right or wrong tool when it comes to Agile. It's more about what's right for your team. On an Agile board, we'll have different columns. In Agile, sometimes they're called lanes, but in Jira, they're called columns. So that's the terminology that I'll use in this course as well. Think of each column like the steps that you need to get a project done. In the simplest of projects, you'll have these three columns: to do, in progress, and done. Now, there are two different types of Agile boards that we'll come across in Jira, and they both look basically the same, but they function a little bit differently. They are Scrum and Kanban boards. These boards function according to the rules of the Agile method that your team is using. Typically, you'll be using either a Scrum or Kanban framework in your team, and then by extension, using that type of board in Jira. But Jira doesn't tell you what those terms mean. So this is just another example of how Jira just assumes that you already know. So let's start with an overview of a Scrum board. As a quick side note, each of these frameworks could be entire courses by themselves, but remember, we're focusing on how they're used within Jira. And when it comes to Jira, there's really one key difference between how these frameworks work inside of Jira. And that difference has to do with something called a sprint, which begs the question, what's a sprint? So a sprint is a block of time that your team will use to decide how much work gets done. Right? So some teams might prefer a 1 week sprint. I've worked with some teams who choose to do a 1 month sprint. It's pretty rare to go more than 1 month. I'd recommend starting shorter, maybe a week or two, and then you can always decide to change that time period if your team feels it's not meeting enough or maybe meeting too much. And then once your team decides on how long they want their sprints to be, the basic concept of the Scrum framework is to figure out how much work you can do in that time period. You want to be realistic about the amount of work that can be done, but as a former colleague of mine used to say, run, don't walk to the finish line, to the end of the sprint. So you sprint to the end of the sprint, right? So let's go back to our Agile board to see how this happens. Let's say our team has decided on a 2 week sprint because in my experience, that's the most common sprint length. Back on our Agile board example, at the start of those 2 weeks, our team will have a sprint planning meeting. In the sprint planning meeting, everyone on the team decides what work needs to get done in the sprint. In our example, that means the next 2 weeks. So in the sprint meeting, if there are high priority items in the next 2 weeks, that's where it gets discussed. Then this is where the self-management comes into the workflow, because over the course of that sprint in those 2 weeks, each team member decides what to work on next. Everybody has already decided in the sprint planning meeting what needs to get done in that block of time. And of course, if there are specific high priority items, then you can discuss that in the sprint meeting. But everyone on the team knows what has to get done. Then, at the end of the 2 weeks, you have another sprint meeting and repeat the whole process by adding batches of tickets to work on for the next sprint. Now, of course, that's a perfect scenario. In the real world, things always come up in the middle of sprints. This is where the run, don't walk part of the sprint comes into play, because in the sprint planning meeting, everyone on the team has already agreed the sprint includes the maximum amount of work that they can get done in that time period. Remember, we're sprinting to the end of the sprint. So if something else comes up, you're basically going to do one of two things. By default, Jira wants you to follow the best practices in Agile, which means that new work gets added to the backlog. Basically, because all the work has already been agreed upon for the sprint, you don't spring new work on people mid-sprint. Instead, you add it to the backlog, so in the next sprint planning meeting, it can be considered. Now, if the work is high enough priority to add mid-sprint, then Jira is going to give you a notification that the scope is changing, and the best practice here is to remove the same amount of hours from the Agile board that you just added on. For example, if the work that you're adding is estimated to be a half day's worth of work, then you'll need to take a half day's worth of work off the current sprint. Usually that gets moved to the backlog so it can be considered in the next sprint. We can't make more time. And since we're sprinting and not walking, everyone's time is already estimated at maximum efficiency. Adding work on top of that is how you start to break down efficiency. People get overworked, corners get cut, quality suffers, and so on. Okay, so that is an example of the Scrum workflow in sprints. If you remember, though, there's another Agile framework that we'll find inside of Jira, and that is the Kanban framework. Not every team works best with sprints, and that's where Kanban comes in, because Kanban does not have sprints. Instead, Kanban workflows use the Agile board in a continuous workflow. There aren't any sprints to break up the work. It just keeps going in perpetuity. So let's hop back to our Agile board. You'll notice the Agile board itself is the same. It's really just how we use it that's different. Now, inside of Jira, there are some different features that we'll look at later on. As soon as the work gets done, you'll notice new tickets are added directly into the to-do column. So they'll get worked on as soon as the in-progress work is done. Now, that's something universal in an Agile workflow, whether it's Scrum or Kanban. Once a ticket is started, you always want to get it completed as much as possible before working on something new. That way you don't end up with everything in progress, but nothing actually getting done. But Kanban doesn't have sprints. So it's basically an ongoing process of just adding work to do and then getting that work done. And that brings up stand-ups, because one of the more common questions that I get is how a team using Kanban will know what needs to get done each day if there's no sprint planning. Often, you'll find teams that use both Scrum and Kanban actually will have a stand-up meeting each morning. The reason why it's called stand-up is it's so fast that nobody needs to sit down for it. Everybody can stand up. But in that meeting, everyone does a quick review of what they did the day before, what they plan on doing that day, and then if they have any roadblocks that need to be addressed. And in that stand-up is where if there are new priorities that come up, like a high priority item that comes up, that can be addressed then. Again, this isn't unique to Kanban, but in my experience, it's the teams using Kanban that rely on their stand-ups heavier than Scrum teams, because the Scrum teams have their sprint planning meetings as well. Okay, so to recap what we learned in this video, Agile methodology has two primary frameworks that we'll see in Jira for how things get done. One is Scrum, which has a sprint where your team will sit down and figure out all the things that need to get done in a predetermined amount of time, the sprint. Then there's Kanban, where there aren't sprints, but your team works on tasks on an ongoing basis. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there's a ton more depth that we can go into when it comes to Agile methodology itself. But now that you're familiar with some of the basic Agile concepts, let's move on to our next video where we'll learn more about some of the more Agile specific terms that we'll find inside of Jira. See you there. In our last video, we got a crash course of some key Agile concepts. In this video, we'll build on that knowledge by looking at a couple of very important Agile terms that we'll come across a lot inside of Jira: stories and epics. So this screenshot is what it looks like when you create a new issue inside of Jira. And quite honestly, this screenshot right here is one of the most common reasons why I get this question from folks who are new to Jira. It's like a task makes sense, reporting a bug in software makes sense, but what are stories and epics? This is just another example of Jira just assuming you already know Agile terms. So let's start with stories. What this is referring to is a concept inside of Agile methodology called user stories. So a user story goes like this. As a insert type of user, I want, insert the goal that user wants, so that the reason the user wants that goal. This is why it's called a user story, because in Agile, a user story follows this basic formula for, well, telling a user story. So here's an example user story. As a website user, I want a dark mode switch so that I can reduce eye strain in low light environments. If you think about it, adding the dark mode functionality requires more than just changing the background color of the website. You have to change all the various font colors, create new icons perhaps, and graphical elements for the site, basically building out a CSS theme that'll get enabled when the user turns on dark mode. Then you have to build the toggle switch itself, and where on your website should that be placed? What will the switch look like? These are all just things that are part of adding a dark mode. Another key thing is remembering what each user's preferences are, because if I'm a user who toggles dark mode and then I close the website, if I come back to the site later, it's just normal to expect that dark mode is still enabled. Can you imagine how annoying it'd be if we had to toggle dark mode every single time we came back to a website? So that's why user stories are a great way to help organize all of this, because in just these examples, we're talking about front-end work to design what the dark mode looks like, and some back-end work to implement the cookies that store user preferences. So instead of trying to break down all the details of everything that's involved in dark mode for your organization's website, a user story like this can save a lot of time while also making sure that everyone is on the same page about what the end user wants. And then as the designer or developer, maybe a little bit of both, it's then your job to figure out the best way to get that done. So here's another example of how flexible user stories can be to help everyone get on the same page and look at things from the end user's point of view. As a homeowner, I want a kitchen faucet with a pull-out spray so that I can easily clean larger dishes. This is obviously a very different industry, but it's another example of how a user story can be helpful to determine what sort of features will help the end user achieve their goal, right? So we can see this example of a kitchen faucet here. Since the story mentions the end user wants to be able to clean larger dishes, when everyone knows that's the end goal, it can be easier to come up with ideas to help the end user do that goal even better. Like this example of a pull-out spray that adds a toggle button for spray modes to help clean dishes easier. As I mentioned earlier, this is more of an Agile term, but since Jira is an Agile tool, that's why you'll find story as the default issue type inside of Jira. Now, to be honest, in my experience, working with a wide range of teams in Jira, not all teams follow that formula every single time. But the goal is to capture what the end user wants. So it's more than just creating a to-do list of tasks, right? Because you're focusing on what is that end goal, which, by the way, Jira also lets you create tasks. So that actually lets you keep the stories as actual user stories separate from the tasks. And we'll learn more about organizing all of these different issue types as we dig into Jira. But before we do that, I wanted to move on to another Agile term that we'll see. and that is the epic issue type. So in a nutshell, if you think of a hierarchical relationship between stories and epics, you'll have epics as the parent and stories as the children. Probably the easiest way to think of epics is like big, massive, epic-sized stories, because most overall projects that you're doing at work require more than one story. This is especially helpful when your team is working with sprints, where a good rule of thumb is if you have a story that needs to span multiple sprints, you can break it up into multiple user stories and then track them all with an epic. So let's go back to our example of dark mode from before. It's not like dark mode is the entirety of the website. So maybe that story is something that goes into an overall epic for the user settings that we'll build for our web app. And then we can have similar user stories under that epic for things like the settings, right? So like maybe allowing the users to customize their profile picture. And of course, if they have a user account, we'll probably want a place for them to change their login details, like if their password, two-factor authentication, and so on. But all those are very different user stories than the dark mode, but they can be tracked by using an epic altogether if we're putting them all in the same place. So to recap what we learned in this video, when you see a story in Jira, it's referring to a user story. Then user stories can be children of an epic, which helps us track all of our stories efficiently. Now that we're more familiar with some of the Agile concepts that we'll find inside of Jira, there's one more bit of conceptual learning that we'll have to do before we hop into Jira itself, because there are a couple of terms that Jira uses in ways that you might not expect. And they're terms that I found people who are new to Jira are often the most confused about. So we'll clarify all of that in our next video. In this video, we'll clarify what Jira means when it's using the terms issues and projects in the interface, because it's probably not what you think. So let's start with issues, because you might have heard me using it already as we're learning about some of the Agile terms in Jira. For all the data we need to track inside of Jira, they are stored in issues. They are the core way to do that because issues contain all your fields. Fields are straightforward, exactly what you would think of, like due dates, labels, the description, and so on. One of my favorite ways to explain issues is to think of them like the sticky notes we're going to put on the whiteboard to track our work, right? The note itself is really just a container. You can write any sort of information that you want on it. And then you can take that to the next level and start to introduce different colored sticky notes to help you organize them better. Now, if you think of each sticky note like it's an issue in Jira, you can do the exact same sort of thing to help organize your issues. In an earlier video, we learned about stories, and then another default issue type in Jira are tasks and bugs, not insects. But remember, we also learned Jira's origins are in software development, so these are software bugs. Later in the course, we'll learn how we can actually create our own custom issue types, but Jira comes with some of these pre-installed. And then just like you can write whatever you want on the sticky notes that contain all your data, in Jira, these issues contain fields which we can configure in Jira to be different depending on the issue type. So maybe on our stories, we've got a simple summary, description, and who it's assigned to. But then maybe for bugs, we want to track the operating system and the browser where the bug was found. And for our tasks, maybe we need to add a due date and priority level so that we can track those. All of this is customizable, of course, but it gives you an idea for what Jira means when it's talking about issues and how you can have different fields on different issues. And that brings us to projects. As I mentioned earlier, projects in Jira are not really what you think of when you think of a project at work. By that, what I mean is that when you start a new project at work, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to start a new project in Jira. So maybe we'll have a project for our web app that includes both stories and bugs, so those can get reported. But our marketing team doesn't need bugs in their project, so maybe instead we'll have stories and tasks for them. And then one of the benefits of organizing it this way is what we just learned earlier. Those different issue types can contain different fields. One of the reasons for that is because inside the project is where you determine the types of issues that you'll have. Now, if you look at this example, the story issue type in the web app project has a due date field that the marketing team's story issue type doesn't track because maybe they don't need that field. So it's just extra for them. Of course, we'll see a lot more of this as we dig into Jira itself, but hopefully you're already starting to see how powerful this sort of organization really is. So to recap what we learned in this video, issues are the containers for information, the data that we want to track in Jira. Then projects are the containers for the issues. Okay, so now that we have a good understanding of some of the key concepts, let's hop into Jira, and we'll do that in our next video. In this video, we'll start getting familiar with Jira by looking at its interface. Now, when you first log in, by default, Jira will send you to this area called Your Work. We can change that default, of course, but for now, let's just focus on understanding how the interface is laid out before we go in and make a bunch of changes. So, as I mentioned in an earlier video, I am using my personal Jira instance for this course. So that's why you're seeing things here. It's not as blank as it would be if it's a brand new installation of Jira. So what you're seeing here is the Your Work page for my user account when I first log in. And a lot of this is pretty straightforward. Up here, we have our recent projects. So this is going to update to show the recent projects that we visited or the ability to view all projects that we have access to. Then if you recall, issues live within the projects. So all this down here are the issues from different projects. You can see the project name that this issue lives in. You can see there's the project. That's the issue living inside of that project, one that we've worked on recently. And then we can also see everything that we viewed recently in Jira here. Now, you'll notice these are not just issues, right? So we have a couple issues in here, it looks like. But there's also things like our projects or filters or dashboards or boards. You can see the name of what that entity is right here at the bottom. Right? And we're going to be looking at each of those features throughout this course, but just know that if you viewed something and you're wondering where it was to get back to it, this can be a great place to go do that. And then any issues assigned to the current user, that's pretty straightforward. And then we have our starred items. So starred items in Jira is the terminology that it uses for basically favorites, and they work like you would expect any type of favorite functionality to work. Just know that if you see the ability to star something, that's adding it to your starred items here. And also at the top menu, you can see these are filters right here, right? So up here at the top, we have a lot of these same filters that are starred up here in our top menu. And that leads us right into our top menu navigation, because this top menu is really where we're going to be doing most of our navigating in Jira, and then everything else underneath it's going to update depending on what we choose. So let's go from left to right to get a better sense for what all this means. So up here at the top left, the first icon is the app switcher. Now the apps that it's switching between are Atlassian apps. For example, we can see I have Jira, but I also have a Confluence license. That is Atlassian's wiki tool for documentation and things like that. So using the app switcher is how we can hop between them. Now, we're not going to be covering Confluence or Bitbucket in this course. We're just going to be focusing on Jira. But here is where you can hop between whatever Atlassian apps you have access to. And if you're linked with multiple different instances, you'll see those in here too. So these are some of my consulting clients. So I can't hop in those for privacy reasons. We learned about that earlier in this course as well. But just know if you have access to different instances, then you'll find those in the app switcher as well. Now, in my case, since this is my personal Jira instance, that's why I put my company logo up here. But by default, you'll just see the Jira logo until your Jira admin changes that. And if you are the Jira admin, we'll look at how to change that later on in this course as well. What it does when you click on it, though, can change. Basically, what it does is it takes you back to your homepage. And as we learned, by default, your homepage is the Your Work page up here. It'll take you right back to the Your Work page right now because that's my default. So if you ever get lost, always click on the logo to get back home. Now, one quick thing I want to point out before we go any further is that Jira's navigation is probably one of the biggest differences that you might have on your end from what I'm seeing here. And this is an example of what Jira looked like back in 2019. And just before I took this screenshot back then in 2018, Jira's menu used to be more along the left-hand side instead of the top like it is now. And I know that's a while ago, 2018, 2019. But as we learned in previous video about the different versions of Jira, depending on your organization's license to Jira, it's possible that you're using an older version. You'll notice there's not even a Your Work section in the menu. And that's because that's a feature that didn't exist back in 2019. So you're not going to see Your Work if you're using an older version before then. And as I mentioned, I've worked with clients who are still using versions that old. So I just want to point that out as an example of what some of the differences might be if you're using an older version. But let's move on to the main menus in today's most recent version. So we do have the Your Work option in the menu, right? So if you do change the homepage and this doesn't take you back there, this can be a quick way to access a lot of the things in there or just to go back to the Your Work page. Now, the rest of these will really start to make a lot more sense as we go through this course to dig into these features. But if you recall from a previous video, Jira uses the term projects a little bit differently than you might think. So in here is where we'll find all the projects that we have access to, as well as any projects that we've starred. You can see we actually have a starred one here, which looks like it's at the very bottom of our list of starred items here. But in here is where we can access all the projects, view all projects, exactly the same as this link here. It's just a matter of whether or not you're on the Your Work page to get back to it. Moving on to filters, you can think of filters like saved searches. And just like projects, you can star your favorite filters for quick access here, view all filters that you have access to, or start building a new one through advanced search. And we'll look at that in more depth later on. We'll also be looking at dashboards and teams later on as well. But in a nutshell, you can think of dashboards as like a quick way to access things that you're working on or build charts that can help with reporting. In fact, before Atlassian added the Your Work section, a lot of that used to be done through dashboards, and these are gadgets on the dashboards. So with dashboards, you can also share them with your team, though. So a common use that I've seen for dashboards now is to let multiple teams have a single dashboard that everyone sees whatever sort of thing you want them to track, maybe the bugs that are coming in, so they can get a high-level view on things like bug counts and how they're being completed. Moving from dashboards, we have teams, and teams in Jira are a place where you can collaborate with other people in your Jira installation. Think of it like a little tiny meeting room. It's outside of projects and it's outside of really anything else. It's its own little space where you can just collaborate with your team. We'll be looking at teams later on as well. But one thing I want to point out here is this little invite people to Jira, because I get a lot of questions about this one too. If you are not a Jira administrator with access to billing, when you try to add someone here, it's just going to send a request to your Jira administrator that says, hey, this person wants to invite somebody else into Jira, accept or reject. And that can have an impact on your bill, which is why it goes to your Jira administrator. It doesn't happen right away. Now, if you are the Jira administrator, we're going to look at where that shows up on the back end later on in this course as well. Now, for these last two items here, we are not going to be covering them because, as we learned earlier, we're just focusing on the core features in Jira. And as you can see, plans are an add-on that's not included in the version of Jira standard software that we're using in this course. And as I also mentioned earlier, we're not going to be looking at any of the extra third-party apps available here, but you can see them right here. And the reason we're not covering, there's just so many apps you can see, so many apps in here, and each one of these could be its own course. And since you can mix and match, there's really no way for me to know which apps your organization has or needs. So we're just sticking with the core fundamentals of Jira first. And if you do have apps that you're using in your organization that you'd like to see some training on in the future, by all means, let me know. So that is the main menu navigation in Jira here. To the right of the menu, we have the Create button. Keyboard shortcut for that is C for Create. And we'll be doing a lot of creating of issues in this course. So, of course, we're going to come back to this screen here and get a better understanding of that. To the right of the create button, we have search. So over here, just the search box itself is extremely powerful, as you can see. And again, we're also going to be using a lot more of this in this course. But I do want to point out, if you hover over this, you can see the keyboard shortcut for search is the / key on your keyboard. Creating and searching for issues will be things that you do a lot in Jira. So I would recommend getting used to using those shortcuts, C for create and / for search, to very quickly be able to access these things that you're going to be using a lot inside of Jira. Moving along, we have notifications, and these are pretty straightforward. You'll start seeing some numbers pop up in here when you have notifications, like when someone comments on an issue that you're watching, or when someone tags your username somewhere in Jira. And this is just a quick way to hop to wherever those notifications come from. Next to the notification, we have Atlassian's help documentation. And I want to point this out because if at any point as you're following along with this course, if something doesn't make sense, then make use of this. Atlassian has some super detailed and incredibly helpful documentation that can answer just about any question that you have. And if it doesn't, then Atlassian's support team is amazing. Now, even though I am not associated with Atlassian at all, I have interacted with their support team a lot over the years. And they've been really helpful to either fix a problem or even just be someone to bounce ideas off for the best practices on how to set up and organize something inside of Jira. Next to the help, we have our settings. Now, in here, you will find all the settings that you have access to. So, for example, if you're a user, you're going to have the settings for just your account and not a lot of the Jira administration settings, right? So I am logged in as a global Jira administrator, so I see a lot more settings than somebody who is not an administrator will do. And of course, we'll be going through these settings a lot in this course as well. Last, but certainly not least, on the far right over here, we have our personal settings, changing things like our profile picture, maybe switching between the light and dark side, right? So we can change a lot of these settings. And in here, you can see this is where we can come in and change our Jira homepage. So if we want this to be dashboards instead of your work, we can do that. And now if I click on this, it's going to go to the dashboards instead of the your work page. Of course, we can always get back to that by going back to that in the menu there. Okay, so that is a look at the user interface here in Jira. And of course, as you've seen throughout this video, as we choose things from the navigation up top, as you would expect, the primary work area of Jira will change to be whatever it is you pick. And we'll get very familiar with all those different areas in Jira. But for now, I would encourage you to take some time between videos to click around in here just to start getting accustomed to where things are and how the interface changes when you click around. And don't worry, you can always get back to your homepage by clicking on your Jira installations logo up here at the top. But with that, we've come to an end of this section. And in the next section, we'll start learning all about team-managed projects inside of Jira. See you there. Before we dive into learning about team-managed projects in this section, we'll take a couple minutes in this video to learn what team-managed projects are and how they compare to company-managed projects. So let's start by learning about team-managed projects. Now, as a quick note, this is another great example. If you recall from our last section when we learned about the Your Work page in Jira, this is another indicator of you potentially using an older version of Jira. If you see something called a next-gen project, because that's what team-managed projects used to be called in 2018 when they were introduced into Jira for the first time. Now, they were rebranded to team-managed projects in 2021. So I just want to point this out because it's another great opportunity to see if you're using an older version of Jira. With that said, even if you are seeing next-gen projects, you can still follow along. But obviously, some things have changed since 2021, so you might see things a little bit differently. However, the core concept of next-gen projects and team-managed projects has always been the same. And that core concept is that they don't require any special permissions to create. In other words, they can be managed completely by your team instead of relying on your company's Jira administrator. hence the name, team managed projects. There is a caveat to that though, because Jira administrators can control who has permission to create team managed projects. So if you can't create a team managed project and you think you should be able to, reach out to your Jira administrator. So here's an example of some entities in two different team managed projects. And you'll notice that the entities for project A are different than project B. Entities are what Jira calls things like statuses and issue types. For project A, you'll notice that we have some simple statuses that we've looked at before, whereas for project B, we have some different statuses and issue types. But if you look closely, you'll notice that both projects have the story issue type. Now, even though they're both called the same thing, they're not really linked together in project A and project B. It just so happens that both of them have an issue type that happen to share the same name. And so if we were to rename it in one of them, like rename it in project B to a task, that you won't notice that change anywhere else except for in project B where you rename it. And that's how team managed projects work, where each one is contained within itself. Atlassian calls these project scope entities, the entities being things like issue types, statuses, fields, and so on. All those things that we're going to learn about configuring inside projects in Jira, collectively, those are entities. And for team managed projects, those entities only live within the team managed project where they are created. On the other hand, company managed projects work with global entities that you can create independently of any other project. So here's an example of global entities. And we can hook up any number of projects to these entities and then share them across multiple projects. So let's say in project A, we want to have the new feature issue type, but we also want project B to have that new feature issue type. Now, what's cool about this sort of setup is that if we wanted to change an issue type, then that'll happen across the projects that are using that issue type, right? So unlike in the example before where we changed a story to a task and it didn't change anywhere else, that would update. So maybe instead of using a new feature issue type, we want to use the subtask issue type. That would get reflected across any of the projects that we have hooked up. With team managed projects, you'd have to make those changes in every single project every single time if you wanted to do it across multiple team managed projects. So you can start to see how this can be a great way to manage your company's Jira projects overall, because the more projects and entity your organization has, the more complex things can get. And that's another great reason why when you're using specifically company managed projects, you're probably not going to be creating them for every single new project that you have to do at work, like we learned about earlier. So to recap, in this video, we learned that the primary difference between team managed and company managed projects are the project scope entities in team managed projects, whereas with company managed projects, it works with global entities. And now their name should make a lot more sense. Team managed projects can be created and managed by anyone on your team because they have project scope entities that are contained within that individual project. Then there are company managed projects which use global entities, so they have to be created and managed by your Jira administrator. Or if you are that Jira administrator, we're going to learn more about that later in this course as well. But for now, let's move on to our next video where we'll learn how we can create a team managed project. In this video, we'll look at the process of creating a team managed project. Unfortunately, this process is very simple, but there are a few things to keep in mind that we'll look at along the way. Now, before we begin, I do want to point out real quick that I am logged in as another user from previous section. I'm logged in as Valerie, who does not have any special administrative permissions. But even without those permissions, we can still create a team managed project. So to do that, let's come over to Projects, click on Create Project. And over here on the left-hand side, we have a ton of different templates that we can use. I'd encourage you to look through these. And that's actually one thing I want to point out to keep in mind is it can be very easy to start a new trial with a different product if you're not careful. So let me show you what I mean by that. If we hop into one of these, maybe service management, IT service management, we can see this says try this template instead of use this template. And the reason for that has to do with what we learned in our previous section with Jira's versions. The version of Jira that I'm using does not include a Jira Service Management license. I don't have the Jira Service Management product, right? So that's why it's try this template. So it's basically going to allow us to try this product as well at the same time. And you can actually see that underneath a lot of the headers, right? So you can see the products that are required for it. And you'll notice that some of these say premium. So if we hop back to Jira Software, because if you recall, I'm using Jira Software. So in the software development templates, we can still see some of these are premium. And if I click on this, you can see it says start your free trial. So you can see the product that is required is Jira, but I have Jira Software Standard, and this requires Jira Premium. So between those two things, the verbiage on the buttons is important. That's one I'll point out. You can see this says start your free trial, right? So between those two things, the different product versions as well as the licenses, that's what I mean by it can be easy to start a new trial without even really meaning to sometimes. I've seen that happen before. So with that said, here in the software development templates, once again, we're building on what we learned in the last section. Is our team working with a Scrum workflow or a Kanban workflow? For our purposes today, let's go with a Kanban template. And you can see it doesn't say try this template. It says use template. But it's important to keep in mind that this is just a template for how Jira sets up our project. For example, we can see the issue types that come with this template: epic, story, bug, task, subtask. But what if you wanted something else? Well, we can still change those issue types later on if we want. And we'll look at how to do that later on in this section. This is just what it's setting up for us to begin with. So let's use this template. And now we need to pick if we're going to use a team managed project or a company managed project. And we already talked about this a lot in our previous video, but the one key thing I want to point out here is that you'll notice I can't even create a company managed project because I'm logged in as Valerie, who doesn't have administrative permissions. So anybody without Jira administrative permissions would have to contact a Jira admin to create that company managed project for you. The other thing I want to point out is up here at this top, this little disclaimer here. Even though we can change the entities like issue types in the project later on, one thing we cannot do is to change the project itself, the project type itself. So right now I'm going to create a team managed project, but if we wanted it to be a company managed project later on, we can't change that. We can't transition it from a team managed project to a company managed project. We would have to create a whole new company managed project later on, or a Jira administrator would have to create that for us. So that's just something to keep in mind. So let's select a team managed project and let's give it a name. Let's say we're building a podcast app. So there's our name. And then we have to give it a unique key. This key is a unique ID that will be applied to the issues in our project. For example, if our project key is dev, then Jira will create the issues in that project with a sequential number after dev. Dev 1, dev 2, dev 3, and just keep going and going. Then you'll notice the URL for where you find the issue is also using the project key. It's why it has to be unique. Now, if we had our project key as something else, the same is true for that project. It will get sequential issue numbers with the project key in front of it. So just to show this in action, if I select the key, type in, I know I already have a project with this key, you can see Jira is not going to allow us to even create that. So we have to create something unique. And now you know the reason why. It has to do with the URL and the issue types having unique URLs. So let's maybe call this app, and we can choose the access level. So we can choose a private, which is only people you invite can see it. It's worth pointing out that any overall Jira administrator can still see the project too. And then you have limited access. So anyone with access to our overall Jira can see the issues, but they can't edit them. It's just read-only access. And then open, anybody with access to our overall Jira can use this project with permission to create or edit issues inside of it. So that's what I'm going to use for this section, create open. Go ahead and click on Next. And now we're ready to create our project, right? So the project is creating here. And we have the ability to connect Bitbucket or Confluence. If you recall from a previous video, I mentioned that I do have licenses to other Atlassian apps, but I'm not going to do that for this course since we are focusing on Jira. But if you're using some of Atlassian's other products, you can connect them here for better integration. I'm just going to click on Continue. And there we go. Now that we have our team managed project created, let's get familiar with how it's organized here in Jira. And we'll do that in our next video. In our last video, we looked at creating a team-managed project. In this video, we'll continue right along to get familiar with how to navigate around the project. So over here on the left-hand side menu, we can expand or collapse. That's where most of the features are that we're going to be using. And right now, they are going to be pretty empty because we just created this project in the last video. But between videos, I did create one issue just so we can see what it looks like as we navigate through the project in these different views. And of course, we'll be going through most of these core features in more depth throughout this section. But because Jira is a project management tool, most of what we'll be spending our time with is this planning section here, which we can expand or collapse these different sections. And as we can tell, the Agile board is the default place that Jira takes us. As we learned in our last section, that's because the Agile board is really where we're going to be spending most of our time. And this looks a lot like what we learned about already with the physical whiteboard and sticky notes with columns, because it basically is. So you probably have an idea about how this workflow on here will go because we looked at workflows on the whiteboard. But we'll be looking at it in more depth later on as we have more issues on the board to work with. Now, you'll notice above the board in the menu is the timeline. Now, if you are using an older version of Jira, this is called the roadmap. They changed that terminology, but it's basically a Gantt chart type view of the issues in our project. And we'll look at this in more depth later on as well. Hopping over the board to the calendar, you can see as I'm recording this, it is a new view. So if you're using an older version, you might not see the calendar view. Calendars used to be an extra paid app add-on. So this is another feature that you might not have on an older version, but as you can see, Atlassian has started to include them without needing anything extra. And calendars are a pretty straightforward view, but it's important to keep in mind that Jira does not require every issue to have a date associated with it. So let's add a due date to the issue because as you can see, it's not showing up on the calendar here. So if we hopped into the issue, we'll find our due dates here. Go ahead and add that due date. And now we'll see it show up on the calendar view. Now, the due date is not a default field in the template that we used, but we'll look at how to add due dates and any fields that we want to issues in a future video. Continuing on for this video, though, we have a list view. And as you probably figured out by now, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have an issue created for this overview video is so that you can see these are all just different ways for us to view the issues in the project in different ways. And I've had a lot of students who think that an issue on their board only lives on that Agile board, and the issues in the list are different. And that's why I only wanted one, because it can get very complex when you have thousands and thousands of issues in your projects. But this makes it very simple to see that really these are just different views. And this is just a nice way to see everything in a traditional list view like you would have in any other to-do list app out there. Now, beneath the list, we can see there's another newer feature here in Team Managed Project, and these are forms. These are exactly what you would think. It'd be a great way to collect information from others directly inside of Jira and try to avoid all that back and forth in email or Slack or whatever communication tool you're using there. Moving along to goals, like calendars, goals are another feature that used to be an extra paid add-on that are recently being integrated in without adding anything extra. And like timelines, used to be called roadmaps, but goals in Jira used to be called Atlas. So once again, it might be something that you don't see or might be named differently if you're using an older version. And we'll look at goals later on in this course. So let's move on to issues, because the issues view is where you're going to go basically anytime you're having trouble finding an issue in a project. For example, remember when I mentioned the calendar view is tied to dates? Well, if you don't have a date assigned to an issue, it's not going to show up in that view like we saw. And the same can be true for some of the other views too that might have some requirements that we'll look at later on as we dig into the features there. Not all of these views are going to show every single issue, depending on what the issues are and what sort of fields they have. But inside this issues view, you're going to be able to find everything. That's where you go to basically find everything. And it's basically the view that you have when you start to search. It's going to take you to the issues view. And again, we'll be looking at search and finding issues, tips and tricks for that later on in this course as well. Now, before we wrap up this video, we do have a few more items down here at the bottom. We have code. If you are working with a dev team, you can hook in Bitbuckets or GitHub to associate a repository for your project. We saw that kind of when we created this project, and we could hook that up. Since we are focused on Jira today, hopping into repositories, a little bit outside the scope of our course, but this is where you can start to do that. And then this is something else that we won't really be digging into much because the project pages are a link to Confluence. That's Atlassian's wiki documentation tool. So similar to the way you can hook up a repository we saw when we created the project, you can do the same sort of thing with Confluence and get a little bit of integration there. And then we can add project shortcuts, URLs that everyone on the team can see for quick access. I've seen teams use this for maybe like internal email or maybe the app link in store, whatever that might be, just a quick way to access that directly on the menu page. And then beneath the shortcuts, we have our project settings, which is where we're going to configure it all. And trust me, we'll be using this area a lot throughout this section as we learn how to master team managed projects. So I know I threw a lot at you, but to recap, what we learned in this video are some of the features like calendars or goals might not be available if you're using an older version of Jira. And as we could see the same issue across different views, we learned that they're really just a way of displaying the same issues in different ways. Even though we only had one issue in our brand new project, when you get thousands of issues, it starts to make a lot more sense to only see some issues in different views. On the calendar view, it's tied to a date. Maybe not all issues need a date, so we don't need to fill up our calendar with a bunch of issues that don't have dates associated with them. Speaking of only having one issue, let's move on to our next video where we'll learn how we can create new issues in the team managed project.
Hi, from everyone at Simon Says It. We hope you're enjoying this training lesson. Please like this video to show your support for the channel. If you want to take your learning further, earn a certificate for this course, and gain access to over 200 courses ad-free, click up there and go to simonsaysit.com. Thanks for watching, and back to the course.
So there are a couple ways that we can create issues, but probably the most popular way is just to click on the Create button at the top. Or I guess if you have a smaller display, it switches to a plus, maybe if you're on mobile. But the other way to create an issue other than using this button is to use the keyboard shortcut C for Create. Do that, opens up the Create Issue screen. Well, the basics of filling in information is straightforward. But let's understand some more of how this screen works and how it's laid out. So everything below this divider line are fields. So all of these are fields. The fields that you see in an issue are controlled by the two drop-downs above this divider line. And it's hierarchical, so it's top to bottom. The project and then the issue type. You change the project, that changes the issue types available within that project, and then the issue type that you select will control what fields you see below it. For example, if I were to, you can see we have couple issue types in this project that we just created. If I were to change this to maybe another project that I've already customized, I have a lot more issue types available in here. And if we were to pick one of these, you'll notice that the fields change. And some of these fields like primary category and release dates, these are custom fields that I've created just for that project. Right? Now, just to clarify, in case you're not a listener, the project that I switched to based on a true story. That's the name of my podcast. I mentioned I'm going to be using my personal instance of Jira for this course. And that's what I use my personal instance of Jira for, to manage the podcast. But that is a company managed project. So customizing that to add in new issue types and new fields, that's done by your Jira administrator. Or if you are the Jira administrator, we're going to look at how to customize that later on in this course. But if we switch back to the team managed project that we created, that means that you don't have to be a Jira administrator to make those sort of customizations, adding in new issue types or fields. Now, before we actually get into how to make those customizations in this section, because I am still logged in as Valerie, there are a couple more things I want to point out when it comes to creating issues. The first is the summary field here is always going to be required. Doesn't matter if it's team managed project, company managed project, the summary field is always required. That is simply because Jira uses it in multiple places. A lot of those views that we looked at previously, so here on the board, that is the summary of the issue. If we go to the issue view, you can see it showed up here, shows up here. The list view, it even says that's the summary right there. So when we create an issue, it's always going to require the summary. Can't change it. That's just always a requirement built into Jira. So let's add in a summary here, something like this. Remember, this is for podcast apps. So there we go. We have our summary. Now, this is the only required field that we have to add, sort of. Depending on your configuration, it is possible to customize Jira to make other fields required. But by default, actually, the only other field that Jira makes required is the reporter. But it also automatically assigns whoever is currently logged in. We can see I'm logged in as Valerie. So it's showing Valerie as the reporter. We can change it if we want to, but it's pretty rare. We don't really have to do that. So we could create this issue at this point. Just click on Create, and there we go. We have the issue that has been created. We've created our second issue in the team managed project. Now, before we wrap up this video, there are still a few things I want to point out about the Create Issue screen, and they are up here at the top right. So at the very top, we have pretty typical things. We can minimize the screen. We can actually exit full screen if we want to make it a little bit smaller. That's easier to type in as we're looking at something else. Or, you can just close out of it if you want, if you don't want to create that issue anymore. But these are really what I want to focus on. This is the watch eye. So the eye icon is to watch. And by default, you're going to be watching an issue when you create it, right? So the issue that we just created up here, we can see that Valerie is watching this issue because she was the one that created it. She was the reporter on the issue, and she was the one that created it. You can change that if you want. If you don't want to be watching the issue, you can disable that, or you can add that back. And watching, basically what that does is that's going to give you notifications up here, as well as email notifications, if that's how your Jira administrator has things set up, for any sort of updates that happen to that issue. So if somebody comments on the issue, if somebody transitions it from, in progress to done, the status is on the board, then you're going to get an email notification as well as a notification in here of what that update was to that issue. Even if you're not tagged in the comment, you don't have to be tagged in the comment when you're watching an issue in order to get that notification. Next to the eye icon on the Create Issue screen, we have the three little dots here. And in here, you can customize the fields that you see on the issues for the fields that are available for that issue. So the project administrator has the ability to control what fields are seen. But let's say maybe it's just a lot of visual clutter. We're not really going to be using things like the team, the attachments, flag, linked issues, whatever. We only want to be able to see these, right? And we can't turn off summary, reporter. We learned those are required fields. Now, if we see, you'll notice that we only have those few fields available to us, right? So it's very different than if we go to all fields, and we can see how that's changed, right? The fields that we have visible to us. Now, the last thing to mention about this, though, if I go back here and just look at these fields, just so that we can see them all. Team managed projects have project scope entities, as we learned. So all the fields that you see here are the fields that this project administrator, which is Valerie, because we just created the project with her account, those are the fields that Valerie has added to this particular project. So if you still don't see the field that you think you should, well, that means it's either not in the project itself, or the project administrator hasn't configured the field to be on the issue type that you are creating. Because if you recall, as we're looking at creating, right? So it's project, but it's also issue type. So the task here has all these fields, but the epic issue type has different fields: start date, end date, issue color, things like that are different than the task issue type. So if you want to customize that, then you're going to have to either talk to your project administrator, or if you are the project administrator, well, let's hop into the next video and learn how we can customize our team managed projects. See you there. In this video, we'll learn how to add our team into the team managed project that we created. All right, so let's hop over to the project settings and into access. Now, the first thing I want to point out is the overall project access that we have here. When we created this project a few videos ago, we allowed everyone with access to our overall Jira instance to be able to see, create, and edit any of the issues inside of the project. As you can see here, it is currently open. Now, we can change that project access here after it's created if you wanted to do that. That's just want to mention that that's where you can change that if you wanted to. We can also see all of the people below who have specific roles within this project. So right now I'm logged in as Valerie. She's the one who created this project. And so Valerie is the administrator of this project. Now, just to clarify for the purposes of the video so that you know, this is our team structure. Valerie is the team leader who created the team managed project. So now we need to add Sophia, Ethan, and Maxwell. And let's actually add Maxwell as another administrator so he can help Valerie manage the project. And the fastest way to do this is by adding them by the roles that you want. So let's add our two team members first before adding an administrator. So let's add people. Just type in the people that we want, and Jira will search for the ones as we type them in. So we can see we already have Sophia and Ethan inside of Jira. We can add them. The role is member. Add those two people, and there we go. We've added Sophia and Ethan into the project. So even if this was not an open project, if we change this to be more private, so only the admins and people that you add, if we change that process, that would mean that, okay, now all of a sudden, only these three people have access to this team managed project, with the exception of a global Jira administrator who has access to everything. But anybody else does not have access to this project. So now let's add in Maxwell as an administrator. So type in his name, change the role to administrator, and there we go. It's a pretty simple and straightforward process. Now, if you remember, team managed projects have project scope entities. So setting Maxwell as an administrator, or even Valerie being administrator of this project, it's only for this project. It's not an overall global Jira administrator. In fact, we can see that the admins of team managed projects are not overall Jira administrators by seeing how Jira behaves when we try to add a user who is not already inside of Jira. So let's do that. Let's just type in somebody else who is not currently inside of the Jira instance. And if we try to add them as an administrative member, doesn't really matter what their role is. When we add this person who is outside, it just tells us that you've requested access for this user. Because we're logged in as Valerie right now, who is a project administrator of this project, but Valerie doesn't have permissions to be able to actually add users to the overall Jira instance. And the reason for that is simply because of how Jira's licensing works for users. Now, you can have as many users as you want inside of Jira, but what you pay for is the number of users who have access. So in this example, we have more users than have access. Even if we change who has access, the license costs would still be the same because we still only have the same number of users with product access. However, as soon as we add new users, our licensing can change. I say can change because all of that depends on your specific Jira license. For example, with my license, I'm paying for up to 10 users with product access. So as soon as I hit an 11th person with product access, that is when my bill will change. So all of that is just to explain why a project administrator of a team managed project can't just add anyone who is not already inside of Jira without being the global Jira administrator, because only global Jira administrators have access to control the billing. And actually, we can see what it looks like from the other side. So this is what it looks like from the Jira administrator side. So I'm logged in as myself here as the overall global Jira administrator. And we can see we have access requests, and we can see the new one that we just had from Valerie to request access for a new user to be added to the overall Jira, which then would then trickle down to the team managed project that she requested access for if that is approved by the overall Jira administrator. Now, the last thing I want to point out, if we go back to being logged in as Valerie, is when it comes to managing our team inside of team managed project is how we can change the roles. So let's say we don't want Maxwell to be a full administrator to be able to add other users. Instead, we just want to have some elevated permissions above a normal member, right? So we can come in here and change the role itself, or we can come in here and actually manage the roles to change what that is. So let's create a new role. So this is, we'll call this our elevated member, basically an admin without adding users. And then we can come in and say, we want to be able to manage all of the issues, but we don't want to actually be an administrator, something like that, right? And we can change any of these roles that we want. But once we create this role, now we can come in and we can change any of these users to be those roles. We can actually have multiples, as you can see, right? And there we go. Now Maxwell has more permissions than a user. He has elevated permissions, but he can't do things like actually administrating the project, adding users, and things like that. Now, I'd encourage you to take some time between videos to look at some of those permissions and the roles that we have available in team managed projects to create the roles that you need for your own team members. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next video where we'll go through customizing the issue types in our team managed project. In this video, we'll learn how we can customize the issue types in our team managed project. So right now, if we create a new issue in the project that we just created, we only can create a task and an epic. But what if we wanted to create something more, maybe like a story issue type? Remember, that's kind of part of the Kanban template. Well, we can come in here in the project settings under issue type. And when we add an issue type over here on the left side menu, you can see that because we picked that Kanban template, it still has some of those templates for the issue types kind of created for us. So if we wanted a story issue type, all we have to do is to click on the story, click on add, and now we have our story issue type that if we come in here and click on create, we can see we can create this story issue type. And all those fields down below are going to change to whatever the fields are that we select. And that leads right into the next part, as you can probably imagine. Right over here from the left side to the right side, it's kind of how this screen works, is left to right. We can see all the different fields that we have on the story issue type, and we can change whatever we want. So we could add in suggested fields if we want to. So say we do want a due date on this, right? Go ahead and click on Save Changes. And now if we come in and create a new story, we'll see that this now has a due date associated with it, if this is something that we need to show up in the calendar view, things like that. Now, we could just leave it at that that can be as simple as it is. But what's really cool about this is we can take this to the next level and really further customize this beyond the templates that Jira has for us. So for our purposes today, the project is all about our team developing a podcast app. So beyond the tasks and stories, we can create whatever sort of issue type we want. Maybe we want a way to track new feature requests. So let's add in a new issue type. Create issue type instead of using one of the suggested ones. And let's just give it a name. Let's say this is our new feature. Add in requests for new features in the app. And then we can change the icon. We can have one if we already have one that we've created. We can do that. Or we can use one of these that Jira has built in, maybe for new feature, new idea. Maybe a light bulb would be a good icon for that. Let's go select that. Click on create. And now with this new feature issue type, as you can imagine, we can create, and it's going to show up here. But now let's customize some of the fields that we have, right? So we could pull in some of these suggested fields here, but what if we wanted to actually create a new one? So you can see actually from my research, let's create this feature location, but rather than just pulling this over that I've already created, let's pull in a drop down. Give it a name. And we can say, okay, what are some locations that this new feature might be at? So maybe the now playing screen, podcast library page, the settings page, the discover, new shows page, playlist, some of the common areas that would be in an app. And then we can choose what is going to be the default one that's selected when you choose this dropdown. We'll see that in a second. Let's say, just so it's not the top or the bottom, let's make it the settings page kind of in the middle here. And we can rearrange this if we wanted to, of course. If we didn't want it in the middle, we can rearrange all of those. Now, before we save our changes, I do want to point out here at the very bottom, we can make this a required field. If somebody were to create a new feature issue type and try to actually create that without using this field, it would not allow it to do that, just like the summary is required that we looked at earlier. And actually, let's go ahead and see that in action. So I'll click on required, save changes. And now that's been created for us. So let's see it in action here. Come into new feature, and we'll see our feature location is chosen. It actually has the settings page as the default, even though it's right in the middle. We can see that in action as well. And then, of course, as you could imagine, if we were to create an awesome feature, have the settings location, and try to create it here, because this is set as the default, it will actually let us create that. You notice that, right? If you want to change that and force the user to actually do that or select one, then we can clear that default. And now, if we come in here, another awesome feature. And now if we try to create, it won't let us because that's required. So that's something I want to point out when it comes to creating new fields. If you have required, and then you also have a default, it kind of overrides the required. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're working. Now, as you can see, there's a lot more than just drop downs that we can do when we add fields to our issue types. So I'd encourage you to take some time as you're setting up your team managed project to figure out what fields your team needs to track what types of things that you're going to be tracking in your project, right? So what issues do you need, and the issue types, I should say, that you need, and then the fields underneath them that are going to contain the information that you want on the issues. Now, in our next video, we'll look at how we can continue setting up our team managed project by customizing the Agile board itself. In this video, we'll learn how we can configure the Agile board in a team managed project. So as you can see, now that we know how to create issues, I've just gone ahead and created a bunch of issues just to fill out our project a little bit more so it's not quite so empty. So to get started, let's look at how we can customize our board, because as we're using this day to day, we don't necessarily need to see everybody else's work. And in my own experience, usually people just want to see the issues that are assigned to them on a day-to-day workflow. So to do that, we can use these little profile pictures up here at the top to filter by who the issue is assigned to. So I'm currently logged in as Valerie, as you can see here. So if we want to filter by Valerie's issue, just click on her. Now, what's really cool about this is additive, right? So we can see not only the issues assigned to Valerie, if we want to also see the issues assigned to Ethan, we can add him to this filter. And now we can see both Ethan's issues and Valerie's issues. Or another common workflow that I've done on the board here is to look for all the unassigned issues, because then we can start to filter these off, or I should say, actually delegate them off. And they're going to get removed from the unassigned filter here as we get them done. So it's just a nice way of being able to clear everything unassigned off the board. Over to the right, we have the ability to filter by issue type. And again, this is additive. So let's say we want to see all of the stories that Ethan is working on currently. So we can see anything assigned to Ethan and the story issue type and the task issue type. And again, this is just a really nice way of being able to see either what's assigned to somebody on your team or to yourself as you're working day to day, to filter on only the things that are relevant to you. Over here on the right-hand side, we can group by a few different things, including assignee. So this is another way of being able to see the board. It's not really necessarily right or wrong. It's what works best for you to have options. So we can see now, if this is grouped by assignee, now on the board we have what would be called swim lanes in Agile terms and Jira terms, are going horizontally across the vertical columns. So now we can see, the unassigned here, and assigned to Sophia, Ethan, and Valerie, and how that works out. And these still work, right? So if we want to only see Ethan, we can see those here. And we can see now unassigned shows no issues because it's all filtered. There we go. Or we can group by subtask. So this is a nice way of being able to see what issues actually have subtasks. So some of these you can see have subtasks. Not all of them, right? So only a couple of them, these issues actually have subtasks in them. So if we open this up, we can see there's child issues underneath this issue. And when we group by subtask, it's showing those on the board there. So just another visual way of being able to see what we need to see right away. Now, the last thing here in the settings I want to point out are these view settings over here, because we can turn on and off different things that we want to be able to see. So watch our cards here. So if I turn off the issue type, you can see now that's turned off, the issue key. So again, if things are a little too cluttered, depending on your monitor resolution and all those kind of things, just a nice way of being able to visually clear up the board to really focus on just what you want to focus on. Now, because we are logged in as the project administrator who created this team managed project, we can take this one step further because we have permissions to configure the actual board with administrative permissions, project administrative permissions. So we can start to add in custom filters that any user roles on our team can use. So to do that, we come up to the top three dots over here, come over to Manage Custom Filters. And let's say we want this to be for new features. And let's just keep this simple. Let's just make this another issue type. So the new feature, I need to put that in quotes. There we go. Let the IntelliSense fill that out for me. Go ahead and click on Create. So now we have this here. So if we go back to the board, now we can see our custom filter that we've built, right? So basically it's doing the same thing as some of these built-in features, but I just want to show that you can actually come in and create some custom filters to do pretty much whatever you want. And I'd really recommend you can come in to look at the syntax help. Atlassian has some great documentation on their Jira query language or JQuery that you can use in these filters. So that's one fantastic way that we can customize our Agile board to work faster. Of course, if you're not the project administrator but think a custom filter would help, just ask your project admin to do that. Now, the last thing I want to point out is that we can do as the project administrator is to configure the columns on the Agile board as well. So by default, our Agile board has these three columns. If we go back here, we can see, actually, let's minimize the menu there. So we can see we have to do, in progress, and done as the three simple columns. So to customize that, let's come in and configure our board. And in here, you can see we have these 3 different columns. Now beneath it, these are the statuses. So to see this, let's actually see this in action. Let's go back to the project itself. And I want to show something. So let's take this issue. And if we open it up, we can see this is currently to do. So this is the issue status is to do. And it's also on the to do column on the board. If I were to take this issue, left click and drag over to in progress, I bet you can guess what's going to happen to the status on the issue. It changes to in progress. We can also change it here. If we change this back to do, it switches back to the to do column on the board. The reason for that is because of what's configured in here, the columns and statuses. Basically, the columns on the Agile board are mapped to the statuses on the issue. And I say mapped because they are not the same thing. We can really see that if we come in, let's maybe take this column and let's call this working on it instead of in progress, just to call it something else. But you can see the status is still in progress. So if we save our changes, go back to the board, take that same issue, once it loads here, here we go. And you can see we drag it to the working on it column, right? If I add this in here, the status on the issue is actually still in progress. That didn't change. We only changed the name on the column on the board. It just happened to be the same thing. So typically with an Agile workflow, we're going to be working from left to right. So it's going to be, to do, working on it, or in progress. Actually, let's go ahead. Let's rename this back to in progress. We can do that directly on the board here as well, as you can see. So rename that, give it a moment to process. There we go. So just so it's back to in progress there. So typically you're going to be working from left to right on the column. So if we were to want to add in a column here, let's add in maybe a review column. And we probably don't want it to be after done, because you'd want done to be on the far right side since you work left to right. So let's take this and move it over to here. So now watch what happens when I take this. Take this over here, add it in, and you can see by default, Jira automatically on the back end created a new status for our issue that matches the same name as the column. And as you can guess, we can come back in here to configure the board, and you can see how that is mapped here. Now, we can take this to the next level, right? If we want multiple statuses on the same column, you can do that. So watch this. If I were to take this, drag this over to in progress, maybe we can just go ahead and delete this column. So now we have in progress and review on the same column. Watch what happens when we take an issue into that column. We'll have the option to choose which status we want, right? So if you see that happening, that's basically how that's set up on the back end. So if we take an issue and drag it, you can see we can either drag it into review. Try not to let it times out automatically to do that when, but you can see there either in progress or review. So drag it to in progress. There we go. So if we open up this issue, you can see that was the one that was in review. This one here, drag to in progress. And then if we want to take another one and drag it to review, we can see that that's been done there. So just a nice way of being able to control both the columns and the statuses separately to customize that for our team. So on the back end, just so we understand what is happening here beyond the board itself. So this is the board here, but you'll notice this says the statuses for the different issue types, and then we can manage the workflow. So the workflow is what's tied to the issues themselves. So these statuses actually live in the workflow, and we can see, okay, this is what Jira follows. When an issue is created, it's taken to the to-do status. If we want to change that, we can do that. If we want to say, you know what, when an issue is created, instead of being to do, let's make it in progress. Oops, I'm taking that create. There we go, and take it to in progress. Go ahead and update our workflow just so we can see this in action here. And now if we create a new issue, we can see it's going to default to being the in progress status. Now in this case, that was just an example. I'm probably going to want to actually move this back to do because that makes more sense. But now you kind of get an idea of how you can control what statuses the issues are. Now this little any right here, this is the transition. So that's saying that an issue can transition from to do to in progress, from to do to done, from to do to review, and vice versa, because it's any here. You can really start to mix and match and say, actually, we only want it to go from in progress to review. You can't take it from in progress to done because it has to go through the review process or something like that. You can start to really customize that and really build that sort of thing out. Okay, so to recap, in this video, we learned how we can filter our issues using the quick filters on the top of the board, as well as how we can create custom columns and custom statuses using the workflow. Now, I'd encourage you to take some time in between videos to do some playing around with how you can best configure the Agile board for your team. Think about the workflow your team needs. What columns do they need? What statuses? Because they don't have to be a one-to-one mapping as we learned in this video. And when you're ready to move on, we'll learn how we can further tailor our team managed project using Jira's features. And we'll do that in the next video. When we started this section, we created our team managed project using the Kanban template. But what if we wanted the Scrum template instead? Well, in this video, we'll learn how we can use our project's features to make that change. Okay, so actually, you know what? Before we do that, I'm going to do one more thing real quick here that I forgot to do in the last video. In the workflow, I do want to point out here, when you edit the workflow like we did, you can actually come in here and create new statuses. So if we wanted to create maybe an approval status, we can add that there. And then we can drag it to the board over here from anything that's unassigned. So what column do we want it to be associated with? We can drag that in there to show that. So just another way that we can add in a status. In our last video, we created it using the column, which Jira will also create a status for you by default there as well. Okay, so let's go to look at our features. In the project settings, let's go to the features here. So in here are all the features we have available to us for our team managed project. And when we created our project, basically what Jira is doing on the back end is just turning on or off these features based on the template that we picked. So here are the team managed project features. If we pick a Kanban project template, these are the features that Jira turns on. When we pick a Scrum template, these are the features that Jira turns on. Now, if you remember from our last section, when we learned about the differences between Kanban and Scrum, we learned that primarily the differences are sprints. So if we picked a Scrum template and wanted to convert that to a Kanban template, basically we could just toggle on the features to do that. In our case, though, we're doing it the other way since we created a Kanban template first. So basically that means there are 3 features for us to turn on. The backlog here, and then scroll down to sprints and estimation. Now, when it comes to estimating, there are 2 ways that we can do this. Estimating time is straightforward, but story points are another Agile term that Jira just expects you to know. So let's define that real quickly. Story points can be an abstract concept, but one of my favorite ways to define them is similar to the way that your team defines a sprint. We already talked about that. Maybe a sprint is 1 week, maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe even a month. The term sprint is defined by your team to mean something. The same is true for story points, but instead of being the time to get work done, like a sprint overall, the story points refer to how much effort it will take to get something done. That also includes the time itself, but therefore the issues instead of the overall sprint. So it goes beyond just the time estimates. For example, let's say we have a user story that will take 6 hours for the developer to do, but then It's got to go through QA, so that's going to add a little bit more time. And what if we have to run it by an external client as well? It's almost impossible to calculate how much time they're going to take. But the story is starting to get a lot more complex than just the time to build the functionality. That level of uncertainty jumps higher than if it's something that you can just knock out by yourself in a few hours. So that's where story points come into play more than just the time itself for a single person to do it, because it can be a unit to help try and capture all of that into a single estimate. An estimate is the key word there because no one can predict the future exactly. So that is an example of story points that Jira is referring to right here, which estimation we want to use. And again, it's an Agile term, so it's not unique to Jira. So there are a lot of great resources where you can read up on the benefits or pros and cons of using story points versus time estimation in Agile. So you can start to figure out how to define that for your team. For our purposes today, though, let's go back to our board in Jira. And now back on our board, you can immediately tell that it's different. So we can see now Jira wants us to start a sprint. So you may not have noticed it when I opened the menu really fast, but we actually have a backlog now. And in the backlog, we have sprints. And if we were to open up one of these issues, now we can start to add our story point estimates. So if we add an estimate to this, you can see that gets tracked there, and we drag it into the sprint, and you can see that estimate starts to fill up. Now, if we go back to the settings in here, there are a lot more features in here that we didn't get a chance to talk about, and I'd encourage you to mix and match some of these to determine which features your team needs the best. And as we learned in this video, at any time, you can always come in here to turn them on or off. So maybe try some features out with your team. And if they end up not helping, maybe just causing too much visual clutter on the screen even, then you can always come in here and turn them back off. Okay, so in the last few videos, we've really focused on the Agile board because that's one of the core areas that we'll be using in Jira. After you've looked at the rest of the features here in Jira, we'll see you in the next video where we'll learn more about some of them, starting with the timeline view. In this video, we'll learn how to use the timeline view in a team-managed project. So let's head over to our project here, and on the left-hand side, we will find the timeline. Before we click on this, though, I do want to point out on the board, we've already looked at these filters up here, but we also have those same filters on the timeline view, and they do the exact same thing, being able to filter by assignee or unassigned, or you can see we can filter by the status. And if you recall from our previous video, when we actually created our custom filter for the Agile board, it shows up on the timeline as well. Now, in the last section, we learned about stories and epics. And epics are key to the timeline view because they are how really everything is organized on here. So let's create some epics to see how this will work. So I'm going to create a new epic, and this will be to make sure that we get the core podcast playback and controls done. And maybe one for the podcast discovery, if I can spell this screen, and then for offline, just to have a couple of them in here. There we go. And I'm just typing and then hitting enter, and then Jira will automatically create that issue and then jump down to the new one so we can very quickly add these in. So now that we have the epics created, if you recall, epics are basically the parents of the issues underneath them. We learned about user stories in particular, because that's another Agile term. But any of the standard issue types that we have in Jira can be the children of epics. So to create a child issue, if we hover over, you'll notice the plus sign here, just to create that. And now we can just type in the summary. This is going to fill out the summary field of this story issue type. We can change the issue type if we want, but I'm good with story. Go ahead and type that out and then hit enter. And we can see Jira has created that story underneath the epic. So now that you've seen how these get added, I'm going to pause the video for a moment while I finish building these out so we can see how they will look on the timeline with just a few more data points to look at. Okay, so now we have a few more epics and stories added. And these are really just issues, the same as if we had created them using the create button up here at the top like we've done in the past. The timeline view just gives us a really quick way of being able to create issues in the timeline itself. And once we have these added, the idea for the timeline view is to work kind of like a Gantt chart where we can plan out the order of things to get done. If we're working on sprints, we can add these epics into sprints. If not, they're just based on time. So if we hover over, you'll notice the time here. We can see the 14 days, and we can just click and start to add in our timeline view. Maybe let's dial these up a little bit just so it's easier to see. And then over on the left and right side, as you can probably guess, you can expand or make smaller based on however long you want. And really all that Jira is doing on the back end, if we were to open up this issue here and scroll down, you can see really it's just adjusting the start date and the due date for this issue. So if we were to hover over, you can see that's 11/10/2024. If we want to change this specifically to something else, we can do that, and that will update on the timeline view as well. So now that we have some time added to these epics, we can actually add time to the child issues, the stories as well, if we really want to get granular with how we plan out our timeline. You'll notice this is saying, oh, wait, actually, the parent needs to be longer than, because the epic is supposed to be inclusive of all of the children, right? So we would want to extend that if we think that the child issues are going to run past either the end or the start. You'll see that as well. So you can start to see the power of just being able to view this in a timeline view. There are a couple other things I do want to point out. So if we right click on this, we can just clear the dates very quickly. If you do end up getting a lot of them going past, or you just need to start over, that's just a quick way of being able to do that. Clear both dates, right click. And on the epics, if you right click, not only can you remove the start and due dates, clear the dates, but you can also change the colors, again, to just visually help see some differences between them as you're starting to build out your timeline. Now, the last thing I want to point out when it comes to epics is this little visual indicator that we have here, right? So we can see it's really tough to see if you look closely, that little gray bar. So that's kind of an indicator of how much we have done. So if we open up one of these issues here and just change it to be done, you can see how that bar updates, right? Maybe let's do another one so we can see a little bit easier. So watch this bar here. See the green? That's the done. 4 of 5 are left to do. So 1 is done. And now you can see the status bar in the epics is updating to reflect that some of these issues are done. It just gives another way of being able to visualize the work that's being done. And that's how the timeline view works in Jira. Now, in our next video, we'll look at another way for us to visualize our work inside of team managed projects with the calendar view. See you there. In our last video, we added dates to issues in the timeline view. In this video, we'll look at another way to visualize that in the calendar view. Now, as we talked about before in the overview, as I'm recording this, the calendar is a new view. So obviously, if you're using an older version of Jira, you might not have access to it. But because we added dates in our last video, this is basically just showing us the start and due date fields, just like we saw in the timeline. So if we open up this epic here, we can see the start and due date. Actually, let's make this something a little bit closer so we can see the entirety of our epic here. Something like that. There we go. So now we can see the whole thing. And now, just like you would expect, and in the similar to the timeline view, we can drag from the ends to change those dates however we may want. We can also just take the whole thing and move it around. If we move it into the past, you can see it's going to say, oh no, it's overdue. It turned red and let us know. So the calendar view works a lot like any other calendar that you're already familiar with. But when it comes to Jira, perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind about the calendar view is that the only issues we'll see in here are the ones that have dates associated with them. So if we were to open up this epic, we can see there's a lot of other stories underneath the epic that we created that are not showing up on the calendar. If we want them to show up on the calendar, we have to associate a date with them. So let's open up one of these, and we have the due date field here. Let's add a due date, and then go back to the calendar view, and we'll see that show up in this view. Let's drag it over here so it has its own. It's just a little bit easier to visually see with the monitor resolution that I have. And then the same is true if we open this up and just remove the date. It'll disappear from the calendar view, but it's not actually being deleted. It's just disappearing from this view. Now, before we wrap up, I do also want to point out that we have some of the same filters that we've seen in the other views up here at the top. So we're not going to spend a lot of time going through them, but obviously the filters here are more associated with a calendar, right? So we can search just like we've seen before. So if we wanted to filter by only things that say have the word podcast in them, we can filter. It's going to remove anything there. We can filter by the type. So issue type, if we only want to see the tasks perhaps, right? We can filter by those, as well as by status, assignee, or any other sort of indicator. There's a whole lot of other fields, basically, is what we're filtering by, any of the fields, right? Really, really cool and powerful stuff that we can do here on the calendar view with the filters. So that is a look at the calendar view. It is a lot like what you would expect from any other sort of calendar, but it can be a great way to visualize and tweak the dates for our issues. Now, in our next video, we'll look at yet another way to visualize our issues in team-managed projects with the list view. In this video, we'll get an overview of how the list view works in Jira's team-managed projects. So the list view is exactly what we'd expect from a list of issues in Jira. And now that we've looked at a lot of the other views, the way that this is organized should look familiar too. Up here at the top, we have the same search box and the ability to filter this list based on the assignees, just like we saw in the other views. And these are additive, just like we saw in the other views. And you'll notice the list itself looks a lot like Excel. And we can actually format this based on rules a lot like Excel also. So let's say we want to see all of the unassigned issues in yellow, just to highlight them a little bit. There we go. So we create a rule. Assignee is unassigned, will be a yellow row. And what happened to the formatting? Where is it? Well, that brings up a very good point with how lists work, is that the formatting will not show up if the field is not visible. So up along the top here of our list, we have the field as columns, basically. And we were formatting based on the assignee. So we need to add in the assignee field. Now, once that's there, you can see our formatting is applied. We can also visualize this a little bit easier by going to assignee, right? So we can do that if we want. Just other ways of being able to visualize our data. Now, what's really cool about this is because it's all inside of Jira, we can customize this list and then share it with others on our team. So let's say we want to share all the stories that were created this week with somebody else. So I'm going to clear this out and let's filter all of these stories that were created from Sunday to Saturday. There we go. Have that applied. Now, when we share this with somebody else, there's a key thing to keep in mind. This formatting that we've done does not get shared. So let me show you what I mean. If I share this with Ethan and then log in, so this is logged in as Ethan here, you can see. That will show up in our notifications. Might take a second for it to show up. Refresh the page here. And we'll give it a second for this to show up. There we go. So we have the list that Valerie shared. And when we open this up, you'll notice we can see assignee, but that formatting is not there. Same with the columns. If you look at the columns, right? So this goes all the way over to team, parent, but the columns that Valerie has are not the same. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you share the list itself is the same. The issues on the list are the same because the same filters are being applied. We can see this filter here, story created. And then on Ethan's side, I'll pull this up a little bit easier to see. It's also filtering by the stories that were created. So it is the right list. It's the same list. It's just that some of the formatting doesn't come through. Hopefully, Atlassian will fix that in the future, but that's something to keep in mind for now. Okay, so to recap, in this video, we learned how to filter the list view, customize the columns we see, and share our list with another user on the team. In the next video, we'll switch gears a little bit to learn about forms in Jira. In this video, we'll get an overview of how the forms work in Jira. So a great way to think of forms is to think of something like Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, except this is built directly into Jira. So as you can probably guess by now, the information that gets gathered is automatically added into an issue. Sounds pretty cool, right? Let's see how this works. So let's hop over to our project and we'll find the forms over on the left side. Now, as you can see, as of this recording, forms is also a new feature. So as I've mentioned before, if you're using an older version of Jira, you might not have access to this yet. So to start, we have to tell Jira what issue type we want this to be when it gets created. So because we just created a project for developing a podcast app, let's use this form to kickstart some feature ideas by asking everyone else in our organization what they love about the podcast apps they're already using. With that purpose for the form identified, it would make the most sense for the issue type to be the new feature issue type that we created earlier. And let's give this a title, better title, I should say. Podcast app ideas, and maybe a description. Next, we need to decide what fields we want to show up on the form. And if these fields look familiar, there's a reason for that. These are the fields that we have on the new feature issue type. But we don't have to show them all. Just like when we're creating a new issue, we don't have to fill everything out. We don't have to show all the fields on the form either. So we can add in field, just drag it over. We can rearrange it however we want to. We can remove fields if we want. We can rename them. So maybe we want, rather than saying this is the summary, let's say this is a brief description. And then make this a long description, something like that. Maybe we want to prioritize the attachment. And actually, let's call this a screenshot. So we can say, can you screenshot like that? So we can get an actual visual of what the feature is that they love so much. Okay, I think that'll get the info that we need. Now, there are a few different ways that we can share this. We can use the default share button to send this to people directly in Jira. Or we can just preview this and then share that link that we get with the form, share it with anybody in our organization through email, Slack, Teams, or anything else. And I'm saying our organization for a reason, because this is actually creating an issue in the project. So whomever is filling this out will have to have permissions to do that in our Jira project. And that's exactly what this little notification up here is telling us, that right now the permissions on our project won't let anyone fill out the form because no one will be able to create issues in the project. So there are two places that we can go to check this. The first is in the project settings with the permissions on the project in access. And here you go. So right now the project is set to private. So we probably want to set this to open. So anyone with access to Jira overall can access this, or we can do limited if we want only some of these people in the project. Let's save and make open. Now, if we go back to our forms, the other place that we can go to look for permissions on the form is right here. So we can say anyone with permissions to create items in this project or anyone who can log in. So maybe we want to make this completely open so anybody in the organization can see this form. And then the process of filling it out is pretty straightforward. So if we were to go through and actually fill this out, maybe say archiving episodes. You even have a screenshot here that we can attach. Drop that in. Add in a long description of what that feature is. Submit that. And then if we hop back into Jira, go back to our issues, we can see that issue shows up that just got created. It's a new feature issue type. It's got the attachment. It's got the form filled out. And if you notice over here on the right side, Jira automatically added the label form so that if we wanted to search for it in here in the issue navigator, it'd be a lot easier to find. Actually, we haven't really talked much about how to use this view to find things. So let's move on to our next video where we'll do exactly that. In this video, we'll learn how to use the issue navigator in Jira. Now, the issue navigator is probably one of the most fundamental views in Jira. And I say that because it's probably been around the longest. When we looked at the calendar view, for example, we learned that's a newer view. The timeline, which used to be called the roadmap, is also a newer view, and so on. Well, the issue navigator has been around pretty much since the beginning of Jira. Of course, its layout has changed quite a bit since then. So let's start by getting familiar with how it's laid out. So along here at the top, we have filters, a lot like what we've seen in the other views, except here in the issue navigator, these are a lot more powerful filters. We can see all the different things that we can filter by. And we're actually going to look at these in a lot more depth in our next section because this issue navigator view is something we'll be using heavily in company managed projects. But when we filter, use the top to filter, this is the list of issues along the left side. So if we want to look for just the stories, we can see that now it's filtered 1 of 23, just the stories. We can even minimize the left side menu to see that a little bit easier. Then over here, the bulk of this view is showing the fields within the issue. So we learned in the last section that fields live on issues, and these are all the fields that live on each of these issues. And one reason why the issue navigator is so powerful is that not only can we see the fields here, we can find the issues, see the fields on the issues, but we're going to be making a lot of changes to the data held by fields. For example, if we wanted to change this summary, we could just go in there and type it and do it. This is where we're going to make a lot of these changes to these different issues. And of course, we can update any of the fields on the issue. But there are a few things here that can be easily overlooked to help us work more efficiently. First, we have our comments by default, but we also have the all activity, we have history, and we have the work log. So the comments are pretty straightforward. The only thing to point out here is that you can mention users. So if we tag somebody, then what that will do is send them a notification up here with a link to this comment. Then we have the history. Now in the history tab, we can see any of the changes that have been made to the issue. For example, if we were to reassign this to someone else, we're going to assign this to Ethan. Now that will show up in the history. Might need to refresh there. There we go. We can also see the work log. So by default, there's not automatic time tracking in Jira, but any user can add the time that they've worked on the issue to show up here. So if we want to say, maybe we spent an hour building the initial functionality, and we can see that show up here. So now that we know what these three are, this all activity makes a lot more sense. It's basically these three activity items in one log. Now over here on the right side, we have the fields on our issue that we can update. Again, this is pretty straightforward, but I want to point out that because we are an admin on this team managed project, we can control the fields right here without going to the project settings. If we click on this little gear, we can create a field. Find an operating system, and that's field type. Drop down. I was typing it in the wrong field. There we go. Creating the field. And then we can add in the option since it's a drop-down, just add a couple. So we can see, you can see Jira is automatically saving this. So now we have this field added to our issues. And if this is a field that we use a lot, we can pin this to the top to make it easier to find. And not only is it going to be pinned on this one issue, but any of these issues. Now, if you remember from our first video in this section, we learned that the fields in Team Managed Project are project scoped entities. That means that this new field is only going to be in this one project. And we'll look at how we can create fields that are used across multiple projects in Jira, because that's how company managed projects work. But in our team managed project, this field exists on all of these issues here that we can see. Now, the last thing I want to point out in this video has to do with being able to quickly hop to the overall field management that we saw in an earlier video. So if we did want to get rid of this field, we can come down here and configure, and that will show us this view that we've been to before. We can find this field, drop it off, save those changes. And now if we go back to the issue, now that field is going to be gone. Oh, looks like it didn't take me back there. Let's go back to our project. And there we go. Yep, that field has been removed. Okay, so to recap, in this video, we learned how the issue navigator is organized. We learned how to update fields, see the issue history and activity logs, as well as how we can create and manage the fields on the issues right here in the issue navigator. Now, we didn't get a chance to talk much about the filters up here, but these filters work exactly the same in the team managed projects as they do in the company managed projects. So instead of repeating the same information twice, if you want to learn more about finding and searching for issues in the issue navigator, we'll be covering that a lot more in the company managed projects section of this course. For right now, though, you might have noticed that we went from forms to issues and we skipped over goals. So let's learn about those in our next video. In the last couple of videos, you might have noticed that we went from forms to issues in Jira's left side menu. And in this video, we'll fill in that gap by learning about goals. Before we do that, let me fix this typo here because that's bothering me. And we can head on over to goals. Goals are basically a central place where you can see a bigger picture of how the work is helping to hit that goal. Now, before we start, as I'm recording this, goals are in beta. They're not even available for everyone yet. And to be upfront, I have no idea when Atlassian will roll them out, but I wanted to make sure that we touch on them so you're a little more familiar with them for whenever your Jira instance gets access. So to create a goal right now, we actually have to go outside of Jira and go into a place called Atlassian Home. And then we can come in and create a goal, either using this or using the create button up here at the top. And since this is for a podcast app, let's say the goal is to publish the podcast app in the App Store. We can select a target date, go ahead and create that. So now that we have a goal created, you'll notice that we have this whole other interface where we can link issues, projects, and things from inside Jira to the goal. So maybe we have a project to get the app designed, another for the dev team to build the functionality. And then we can tie together the epics from different projects to the goal as a way of tracking it all, sharing updates across all the teams and so on. And here's where it can get really confusing because goals is outside of Jira right now. So when you see it talking about a project, it's not talking about the team managed project that we just created. This is a completely different project, and we can see this project created in Atlassian Home. If we create this project and then head back over to Jira and look at all projects, it doesn't show up anywhere because it's not actually a Jira project. And that's where it can start to get to be a little bit confusing. Now, one of the things we can do in our team managed project is to link issues to the goal. And that's really the primary reason why we see them in our menu in the team managed project. So if we were to go into one of these issues, we can see we need to actually add that field. I don't think we've added that yet. No, we haven't added the goals field. So let's add the goals field to the story issue type. And then if we go back, now we'll see the goals. We can pin that so it's a little bit easier to see. And we can look for that goal that we just created. There we go. So we have that added. And then over here in Atlassian Home, we can go to Jira to see what issues are currently contributing to this goal, to achieving this goal. So as you can see, at the end of the day, goals are just another way of being able to track our work. Okay, so to recap, in this video, we learned that goals aren't really a part of team-managed projects or even company-managed projects or even Jira itself, if you think about it, since it takes us out of Jira to access them. But they are in beta, so I really hope that Atlassian will start to integrate them better. And now you've got a better idea of what goals are and how they work. And I encourage you to play with goals between videos to see if maybe there's something that your team can use. Or maybe by the time you're watching this, Atlassian has started to integrate them a little bit better. And when you're ready, I will see you in our next video where we'll wrap up this section by taking everything that we've learned so far and using it in an example daily workflow in our team managed project. See you there. In this video, we'll take everything we've learned so far and go through an example daily workflow in a team managed project. Now, if you recall from our Agile Crash Course video, we learned about something called a stand-up. And in my experience, usually that's what you do first thing in the morning. So on the board, if we come to the top right, we can start our stand-up. And you can customize the time, of course, depending on the size of your team, how many team members you have. But the basic process here is that each team member gets a couple minutes to answer these 3 questions. And inside of Jira, during the stand-up, we can see what things are assigned to that team member as they're answering the question. Questions are, what did you do yesterday? What will you do today? And are there any blockers preventing progress? This is one of the ways that an agile workflow helps everyone be on the same page about all the work that's being done. Again, the concept of a stand-up meeting is not unique to Jira, but in the newer versions of Jira, they added this nice little view to help the stand-up be more effective. And as the timer ticks down, by default, we'll hear the little ticker to let everyone know as they're talking it's time to wrap up. And then you can move on to the next person and repeat the process. So for Valerie, let's pull one of these issues over for her to work on today. There we go. And as the timer hits 10 seconds, we'll hear that noise. There we go. So now we move on to the next person. The timer will automatically start and the process repeats. So in our example here with 3 people on the team, even if we left the timer at the default of 2 minutes, that's a quick 6-minute meeting that'll help provide clarity around what everyone got done the day before, what everyone is doing today, what sort of roadblocks someone is facing to help clear them if possible, or at least to know why something isn't being completed. Now, when everyone has had a chance to go, you end the stand-up and everyone gets to work for the day. So ending the stand-up is as easy as coming up here, go end stand-up, and it'll take you back to the Agile board. Now, we've looked at a lot of the different views that we can use throughout this section, but in my experience, the Agile board is where most of our work will be getting done on a day-to-day basis. And the basic process in an Agile workflow is to take an issue from left to right. So you notice we took it from to do to in progress to work on for that day. And then when we're done with it, drag it into done. And you'll notice that when we drag it into done, Jira automatically set this issue to resolved, which is why the issue key on this one is crossed out. And then once it's done, you pick the next issue that you decided to work on in the stand-up or sprint if you're working in a Scrum workflow and continue on. Of course, that is in an ideal situation. As we all know, things are not going to be ideal every single day. So Jira does have a few cool things that we can do when that happens. So let's say we're working on an issue throughout the day, and there's another issue that is blocking our ability to get this one done for whatever reason. Well, what we can do is we can let people know that this issue is blocked. So let's say this one is blocked by this one here. If we come into the little dots here, we can link issue and say it's blocked by app 10. That's this issue here. Link that. And now when we have our stand-up, we can open this up and look at it and say, oh, that one's blocked. That's why. And then we have that conversation of, do we have any roadblocks in the stand-up that we just learned? And there are other links that we can add too, but blocking an issue is really helpful because once this is blocked, it'll show up for everyone on the board on the insights to see that this issue is blocked. Or maybe it's not really blocked. Maybe as we're working on it, we just need to raise attention. Well, you'll notice we can actually add a flag to, let's talk about this in stand-up, something like that. And not only does it visually change the color, but it also adds a flag there, and it will show up in our board insights under the flagged tab as well. So that's a great way to make sure that something gets brought up in the next daily stand-up or sprint if we're working in a Scrum workflow. Okay, and with that, we've come to an end of this section learning all about team-managed projects. Now, if you recall, we learned at the beginning of this section that team-managed projects have project scope entities. So let's see that real quick in action. If we were to come in here to projects and create a new project, let's do this same thing that we did before. We're rushing through this because we've done this before. There we go. So I'm creating a new project, new team managed project. And now, once we actually get into this project, we'll notice that some of the issues, the issue types, I should say, don't even exist in here. So if we come into our project settings, as we can see, the new feature issue type that we created in the other team managed project is not there because it only lives in that project we created it in. That's because of the project scope entities. Now, that can certainly be a great thing in some cases, but depending on the size of our organization, there's a good chance that your team is sharing entities across company managed projects.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To see the full course that this video came from, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.